Welcome back to Computer Science 4303. We just finished our midterm break, so it feels like I haven't been lecturing in weeks. But here we are, and I've rearranged the schedule a little bit because last year's schedule was down here just as sort of a guide for what we should do, but we can change that at any time. Previously, in last year, I would give the project information right now, but we've already given the project information. So here we are. It is Tuesday. Just make sure you are working on assignment 3 because that's due in 2 days or on Thursday. And keep in mind that the deadlines for the project proposal and A4 are coming up. So if you have not yet looked into a group member for the project or what you plan on doing for the project or what you plan on proposing, now is the time to get back into that. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then it was in the past when you should have started working on that because it's pretty important. So make sure you stay on top of that. So today's lecture, we're going to be going over an introduction to StarCraft. So let me close down the Discord here and we'll get started with that. So this lecture is an introduction to StarCraft, an introduction to BWAPI, and a little bit of an introduction to StarCraft AI. I looked online and I really couldn't find any good videos on sort of a really basic introduction to like what StarCraft is. There are hundreds of thousands of strategy videos, of high-level play, of, okay, you're already playing StarCraft, now you want to know how to be better, or like pro matches and commentary and stuff like that, but I couldn't find any video that was just like, okay, what is StarCraft, right? Because in this course, I'm going to have people who potentially have never even heard of StarCraft or have never played StarCraft. Now they're writing a bot for StarCraft. So I really wanted to have a good, really low-level introduction to like going from absolutely nothing, what is the game, to knowing enough to be able to implement a basic strategy. So this lecture is a really basic introduction, just going over what the game is, what sort of strategies mean, how you can look up information about the game and stuff like that. Then I'm going to get into a very basic introduction to the Brood War API, which is how you will actually program your project in StarCraft. And then I'll talk a little bit about why StarCraft AI is interesting. Why do we actually have it in an academic course? Why is it worth talking about? And then the next lecture, a future lecture is going to be a more deep dive into BWAPI and how you get that all set up and running and stuff. So the next lecture will be how you set this up and how you set up the Minecraft stuff. And then a future lecture will be a deeper dive into how BWAPI actually works and how you will go about programming your bot. So this is not the only lecture on these topics, it's just the introductory lecture on these topics. So before we get started, here's some useful links. So all of the BWAPI stuff is available on GitHub, so you can go to any of these resources up here for GitHub, and all of these down here are all about strategy for the original version of StarCraft. So this is from Liquipedia. It's sort of the main wiki for StarCraft information, especially for the original version of StarCraft. Make sure that whenever you look up StarCraft stuff, you're not looking at StarCraft 2. That's the thing you're going to find most readily these days. We're actually using the original version of StarCraft Brood War. So for those of you who don't know, what is StarCraft? Well, StarCraft was made by Blizzard in 1998, and it is by far the best-selling real-time strategy game of all time. Millions of players have played StarCraft worldwide. It's been played professionally since 2001. Along with Counter-Strike, StarCraft was really the game that made esports sort of this worldwide phenomenon. So you basically have like Quake, Counter-Strike, and StarCraft that sort of created the esports scene back in the late, around the turn of the millennium, anyway. We can also program StarCraft using C++ with the Brood War API. And so the Brood War API, as we'll find out, it reads StarCraft's memories. It lets you issue commands to the game and get data from the game, see where your units are, that sort of thing. And we'll get into that a bit more in the lecture. So StarCraft is a warlike simulation. You can play StarCraft. There's a single player campaign, but we're mostly interested with the multiplayer game, right? There is a great single player campaign that you can go through and see kind of the lore of the StarCraft universe and play through all the different the storylines and stuff like that. But we're just considered with like the multiplayer 1 versus 1 StarCraft game. And in most, a game of StarCraft kind of flows like most other RTS games, where you start out with very few resources, and so you have to gather resources. Then you're going to use those resources to build a town or an army, and then you use that army to do combat with your enemies. And the goal of a StarCraft game is just build an army and destroy your enemy. Technically, in Brood War, in order to win the game, you have to destroy all the buildings of the enemy. So you can win the game without defeating the other player's army if you can somehow get past the army to kill all the buildings. So you really have to kill all the buildings to win a game of StarCraft. So, like other RTS games, there are 3 main categories of strategy in a game of StarCraft. So the first one is attacking. So attacking, you may have also heard of like a Zerg rush or an aggressive type strategy. So in an attacking type strategy, you're going to attack your enemy very early in the game. So you're going to build as many attacking units as you can very, very fast and just send them and hope to win the game immediately. There's a defending type strategy. Sometimes you call this turtling or bunkering, where all you do is you just build defenses and try and fend off any attack from your opponent. And the third type of strategy is called expanding. Some also call it an econ build or multiple bases, second base quick, something like that. And an expansion type build, you're not going to build attacking units or defending units. You're going to build an expansion early, and we'll talk about what an expansion is, but basically another base so that you can get more income very, very quickly. And it turns out that there's sort of this rock, paper, scissors effect with these strategies. So it's really interesting that no one strategy is always going to win, because it's almost exactly like rock, paper, scissors. So let's just think about that for a second. So if I attack and you expand, well, an expanding person just builds an expansion, another base really, really quickly. It doesn't build any defenses. So if I've chosen to attack and you've chosen to expand, I basically just win the game, right? If I've chosen to expand and you've chosen to defend, then what I have done is put my early game resources into getting more resources over time. So I've got a really good economy going, and you've spent all your resources building turrets or bunkers or cannons or something like that. And so what you've done is you've wasted your money on all this static things for defenses because an attacker never came. And so if I choose to expand and you choose to defend, then you just lose the game. Now, the last one would be if I chose to defend and you chose to attack, then typically in the balance of these games, when you go to design these games, defensive things are usually cheaper to make than attacking things, right? So if I build a bunker, it costs much more money to destroy that bunker than it did to build the bunker. And so if you went for a really aggressive early attack, but I defended it properly, then you're left with almost nothing. And so defending typically beats attacking. And so what happens in a game is that you're going to start out, and we'll see this more in a bit, but you don't really know what the enemy is going to do. You can't see them. And so you sort of have to choose one of these things, or maybe like a blend of 2 of these things, to do at the start of the game. And then as you figure out more information, as you scout the opponent and see what they're doing, you're going to change your strategy depending on that. Right? So if I started out, for example, thinking I'm going to go for a really early aggression build, and then I send one of my workers to go scout them and I see that they're building bunkers, well then my really early aggression isn't going to work. So if I see them building bunkers, maybe I'll pivot from an attacking strategy to an expanding strategy or something like that, right? So that's how the game of StarCraft kind of goes, is you choose something to do at the beginning, you scout your opponent, you see what they're doing, and then you try and do the thing that is good against the thing that they're doing. And that cycle repeats the whole time the game is going on. In StarCraft, you get to choose between 3 different races or factions in the game. If you played a game like Warcraft or Command & Conquer in the past, like one of the very first real-time strategy games, there were only two factions. So, for example, in Warcraft, there were orcs and humans, right? And the orcs and the humans were really just, you had a footman for the human and you had a grunt for the orc, and they were basically the same unit. Now, it turned out that in Warcraft 2, like, the two races were almost identical except for ogre versus knight, but it was really just, you just chose one of them, right? But in StarCraft, what they did was this really very interesting thing where instead of just having, two factions that were functionally identical, they made three completely different races. And so in StarCraft, you can play Terran, you can play Protoss, or you can play Zerg. And this screenshot is from StarCraft 2 because it looks a lot nicer. But we're talking about the original game of Brood War. But all of the things I'm about to say pretty much go for both games, okay? So the Terran, these are the in-game descriptions: dominate the battlefield with superior firepower. Protoss, annihilate your enemies with psionic powers and advanced technologies. And Zerg, overrun entire planets with the unyielding might of the swarm. So each of these races have different play styles and strategies and units that you can choose from. So let's go over just a little bit about each race first. So the Terrans are kind of like a human-like faction. They're not called humans, but in all the cinematics and stuff, they look very human-like. And so this is sort of, Earth's last defense against the aliens or something. So the Terrans are a human-like race. They like mech units. So mech units being things like tanks, battle cruisers, Valkyries. Their bodies are quite frail, but they're good with technology, sort of thing. Their buildings, one of the unique things to Terran, so each race has kind of a bunch of things in common with other races and something that's very unique about their race as well. So the thing that Terrans can do that other races can't do is their buildings, most of them, can be lifted up and moved around. So you can reposition your buildings if you want to. And also, the worker units of the Terran can actually repair mechanical units and buildings, and other races can't do that. So the really popular early game unit for the Terrans is the Marine. And so the Marine is just kind of like a human in a mech suit. So if you've played any StarCraft, you're very familiar with the Marine. It's a low hit point ranged attacking unit, and it hits flying. So the Terrans have a little bit of an advantage because even though their starting units are quite weak, their starting units are the only ones that have ranged attack and can hit flying. And so the Terrans are good all game, the medic unit can heal them, and so one of the strategies that you can do with Terran is just building a bunch of medics and Marines and then attacking with those things. A mid-game unit that's really popular with the Terran is this siege tank. So the siege tank is a very iconic unit in the StarCraft universe. It's a slow-moving unit, and while the siege tank is moving around, it can attack for a little bit of damage, but the really unique thing about the siege tank is that you can stop it from moving to enter siege mode. So while it's in siege mode, it can't move, but when it's in siege mode, it does huge area effect damage, and it can attack almost the entire way across the screen, okay? So siege mode is this like really iconic thing for the Terrans, and it's really good defensively because it shoots so far that it's really difficult for other units to get to it before they're able to destroy it. And in the late game, the super late game unit for the Terran is the battle cruiser. It's a huge flying ship, lots of hit points, lots of damage, has this thing called a Yamato cannon that can just like destroy enemies with one hit and stuff like that. So the game of StarCraft and many RTS games are kind of separated into these early game, mid game, and late game, right? So early game, maybe before 8 or 9 minutes in the game, mid game, 9 to 15 minutes, and late game would be 15 minutes and on. And as you'll see, as you build more and more units, more and more of these units unlock, sort of. So for example, the tank, you need a factory to build a tank, and you don't start with a factory. A factory needs a barracks, and you need a worker to build a barracks. We'll get into that in a little bit. But there is this sort of time partitioning of a game of StarCraft into these things like early game, mid game, and late game technologies. So the Protoss race is sort of like a quote-unquote civilized alien race. They're highly intelligent, and they kind of have more expensive units than others. The unique thing about Protoss is that their units have shields, and so they have shields and hit points. So for example, a Zealot, I think they have 80 shields and 80 hit points or something like that. So if your shields are gone, so only when all of your shields are gone to 0 do your hit points start being removed. So in order to kill a Protoss unit, like a Zealot, you have to take away all its shields, and then you have to take away all its health. So that's, and the shields regenerate over time. So that's kind of the unique thing about the Protoss. Another unique thing is that you can't just build buildings wherever you want with the Protoss. They actually require power from pylons. And so a pylon is a building that provides power in a radius, and then you have to build buildings on top of that power. So I'm actually going to play a game of StarCraft in a little bit, and I'll show you the Protoss race so you can see what this means. Their early game units, the Zealot is the first unit you can make. It's a very tanky melee unit. And then an early/mid game unit is this Dragoon, which is a tanky ranged unit. So the Protoss units are more expensive than Terran units in general, but they have more hit points and they deal more damage. So it kind of evens out. A mid-game unit that's very iconic to the Protoss race is the High Templar. The High Templar is a spell-casting unit, so it has mana, and you use that mana to cast Psionic Storm, which deals AoE damage over an area of the map. So there are some units in the game that can cast spells or special abilities like this one. And one of the late-game units of the Protoss is the Carrier. It's a huge flying ship, and it actually shoots out smaller ships that then do damage to things. Okay, so the Carrier, super late game, if you can build a bot that makes carriers and it gets to the late game, then you're probably going to win the game, right? It's a very, very expensive unit. I think it's the most expensive unit in the game. And then we have the third race, which is the Zerg. They're sort of the, they're the swarm, the uncivilized alien race. And the thing about the Zerg is that they make tons of units. They make a lot of very cheap units, and they just sort of send them at the enemy in waves, trying to kill them. Their units, the unique thing about the Zerg is that their units regenerate hit points over time. So they don't have shields, but they do regenerate hit points. So in terms of hit points, Terran just have hit points, but they can be healed or repaired. Protoss have shields that regen over time, and Zerg have hit points that regen over time. And the other unique thing about the Zerg race is that their units are not constructed by buildings, they're morphed from eggs. Okay, so I'll show you an example of this later as well. And they must build their buildings on the creep. And so the creep is this thing on the land that you can build Zerg buildings on. And if you build a hatchery, more creep sort of spreads out. So I'll show you that as well. Their early game unit is the Zergling, probably the most famous unit in all of StarCraft. It's very, very cheap to make. It's only like 50 minerals to make, and you get 2 of them for 50 minerals. They're very fast. You can rush with them easily. An iconic mid-game unit for the Zerg is this Mutalisk. It's a very fast-moving flying unit. It's very micro-heavy, meaning that it can turn on a dime and you can shoot and move and kite and all sorts of crazy stuff. And a late-game unit might be like an Ultralisk, this huge tanky bug that does huge damage with its claws, or a Devourer, which is a spellcaster that can cast this thing called Dark Swarm. It's a really interesting ability. So very, very late game Zerg involves making melee units, and you cast Dark Swarm so that your melee... Inside a Dark Swarm, you can only attack from melee distance. And so you make a bunch of Zerglings, you cast Dark Swarm everywhere, and then you attack, and the Marines can't fire, the tanks can't fire, that sort of thing. So, I just explained what the races were, but what about StarCraft units? Well, the whole point of StarCraft is that you create and control these units. Each unit that you have can be given commands like attack, move, patrol. You cannot control your enemy units, so you can click on them to see their hit points and stuff, but you can't control them. So you can move a unit, attack, patrol, workers can build things, you can tell them to stop what they're doing, repair, that sort of thing. And these units take parameters, right? So you want to move to a position, you want to attack a unit, you want to build a type of building at a position. And when you're playing the game, you're not even thinking of these as parameters, but when you start programming, you really start thinking of them as parameters. So when you're playing the game, you give those parameters as mouse and keyboard input, right? Like you click, this is where I want to move. But when we start to program the game later, you're going to be passing in other data structures, and we'll get to that later on in the lecture. So each StarCraft unit has a number of properties associated with it. And I want to make the difference here between instances of units and types of unit as well. So each unit instance has unique properties. So what I mean by a unit instance is that a specific unit that is living in the game, right? So I have created, I start the game with 4 instances of a worker unit. So each specific unit that's in the game, I'm calling that an instance, that has a current position, right? So it's at X, Y location, whatever. It has a current amount of health or shields. It's controlled by a specific player. And each unit instance has a unit type, okay? So the unit type specifies what that unit can do. So for example, I might have 5 units total. So let's say I have, I know these are different races over here, but let's say I have 3 Dragoons and 2 Mutalisks. So Dragoon is a unit type, and I have 3 instances of that unit type. So I hope you understand the difference between what I mean. An instance is a specific alive unit in the game, and a type is the type of unit that instance is. And the unit type properties define things like the maximum health for that unit, how much damage that unit does, the weapon type that it has, whether or not it's flying, its size, its price in terms of minerals and gas, how far it can see. It has all sorts of properties associated with that type. And the unit type properties are shared by all of the instances of that unit in the game, right? So if I have 500 Marines, if I have 100 Marines in the game, then each of those Marines has the same maximum health, it does the same amount of damage, it has the same weapon type, etc., because they all share the same unit type. And I know that this seems very pedantic, and why are you even saying this? We all know that things have types, but when it comes to programming this a little bit later, the unit and the unit type are completely separate things. And so we want to make that distinction very early. So I've included charts of the unit type properties here, and this will all be in the PDF. So rather, I'm not going to list all of these out, but I wanted you to have a single document with all of this information in it so that when you go to program your bot, you can have a quick resource that has everything in one location. So you can see here that Protoss have a bunch of different units like Arbiter, Archon, Carrier, Corsair, blah, blah, blah. You can see that, a probe, it costs 50 minerals. It takes 1 population, so it costs 1 supply to make it. It has 20 hit points and 20 shields. It does 5 damage to ground units. It does 0 damage to air units because it doesn't have a weapon that can attack air. Its attack cooldown is 22 frames. StarCraft Brood War runs at 24 frames per second, so it attacks about once per second. It has range 1, meaning it's a melee unit. It has a sight radius of 8 and has a build time of 20, which is 20 seconds, okay? So that's what all the different properties are, and you can look, here's all the Terran units, and here's all the Zerg units, all right? So these will be there for you. Each unit in the game has a different size, and StarCraft unit size and movement are measured in pixels, okay? So you can see here, all these units have different sizes, and units will collide with each other as they're moving, okay? So if you have a bunch of Ultralisks over here, which are 38 by 32 pixels in size, then those are going to clang, bang together way more than a bunch of Zerglings who are half that size, right? Okay. Next, I want to talk about the StarCraft tech tree. So each building and unit in the game has a set of things that are required to build first. So for example, when you start the game, you just have your resource depot. So if you're a Terran, that's a command center. Protoss, it's a nexus. Zerg, it's a hatchery. And you have a few workers. So I can't build a Marine immediately because I'm going to have to build a barracks and then build a Marine, right? With the Protoss, I need to have a gateway to build a Zealot. But to have a gateway, I need to have a pylon to provide power to the gateway, right? In order to build a Dragoon, I need to have a cybernetics core. And in order to build a cybernetics core, I need to have a gateway. And so there's all these prerequisites. And those prerequisites or requirements in the StarCraft world, they're called tech. And the tree listing of all that technology is called the tech tree. And I've included all of the race's different tech trees in the presentation as well. So let's say, for example, you want to build a shuttle. Okay, so I know this is a bit small, but you want to build a shuttle. So over here, it says in order to build a shuttle, you need to build a nexus, then a gateway, then a cybernetics core, then a robotics facility. So if we look over here, this is the tree, the visual representation of that. So a shuttle comes out of a robotics facility. The robotics facility requires a cybernetics core. The cybernetics core requires a gateway, and the gateway requires a nexus. However, not shown here is that, you still need power for these units, and so a pylon is also necessary. And also, here is the tech tree for the Terran units and for the Zerg units, and so all that'll be in the PDF for you as well. So an example game for Terran might go something like this. You start off the game with just a few workers. So keep making workers until you hit 9 workers, for example. So down here, we start with 4 workers. So we've built 5 workers. We're going to make a supply depot so that we can build past our initial limit of 9 or 10 supply. Then we're going to make workers until we have 12 supply. Then I'm going to make 2 barracks, which produce Marines. Then I'm going to keep making Marines and workers and supply depots, and I'm going to attack when I have 12 Marines or more. Okay, so that's an example of what the actions I might take in a game of StarCraft. And so this sequence of actions of making 5 things and then making a supply depot, then 3 more SCVs and 2 barracks, that's called a build order. Okay, so you're going to look online for different build orders so that you can implement different strategies. So a build order is a sequence of economic actions. It's a list of buildings or units to build in order so that you get things done efficiently, right? So for example, this build order here, what's going on? Why can't I can't move my mouse out of PowerPoint. Sorry, one second. Okay, that was really strange. All right, so this sequence of economic actions has me making an SCV here, another SCV, another SCV, and SCVs are workers for the Terran race. I could have built a barracks this early if I wanted to. However, by building workers sooner, I have more income to build more things, right? So there's always the trade-off in a build order of, do I want to build things quickly at the expense of later economy, right? And economy in an RTS game is sort of this quadratically scaling effect. You want to build it at the beginning, because if you build economy at the beginning, then you have that much economy for the entire rest of the game, right? So make sure that you can make build orders with trial and error. You can just go build some stuff, but there are lots of build orders out there for you. Okay, so an example build order that I took from Liquipedia. This is a 2 racks fast expand build, which it means you build 2 barracks and then you expand. Would be listed as something like this, and you may look at this and say, "Oh, like what do these numbers mean?" Well, you're going to start out with 4 workers, okay? So you have 4 workers, and this just says it is assumed at any given time up until the end of the listing of the build order that you're always making workers in the background. It's very good to just always be making workers. So it says you're going to build workers until you get to 9 total supply, meaning 9 workers. Supply is the food consumption of all your units. So workers take 1. So when you get to 9, you're going to build a supply depot. Then you keep making workers in the background, and when you get to 11, you're going to build a barracks. Then you keep making workers, and so in between 11 and 13, you've built 2 more workers. Then you build another barracks, then you build a supply depot when you get to 14, and so on and so on. So this tells you It's sort of a list and timing of when to build everything. And someone has, you know, put hundreds and hundreds of hours into testing these things. Here's another example of a build order on Liquipedia, and this is for the Protoss race. So this is a 10-12 gateway expand. And it says the 10-12 gateway expand build order is designed for maps with very difficult pathing. Theoretically speaking, it could be adopted with maps on which Protoss has a backdoor expansion like blah, blah, blah. Okay? So in this one, it's called a 10-12 gateway because you build a gateway at 10 and you build a gateway at 12 as well. So I'm actually going to show you this build order. I'm gonna open up StarCraft and look at this build order. So let's do that now. So I'm gonna discard my annotations and I'm going to switch over to this StarCraft scene, and I have put that build order on the screen so that you can see what we're trying to do here. Now I'm going to implement this very poorly. I used to be, geez, 10 years ago I was like Diamond StarCraft 2, but I've never been very good at Brood War. So let's just see. I'm going to turn on the desktop audio. I think you should have sound here. So this is the original Brood War client. I'm playing in a window, and I'm going to play a custom game, and I'm going to use one of the maps from the AIIDE competition called Destination. It's a kind of a vertical map where I start at the top, or I start either at the top or the bottom, and the enemy is going to start at the other end. And I'm going to play as Protoss, and I'm going to play against Protoss. And the only reason I chose Protoss for the opponent, I could choose anything, is because I know that the built-in AI does not rush really quickly with Protoss, and I want to live long enough to like show you this build order. So we're going to start the game, and you're going to see immediately that I'm going to start with a Nexus and 4 workers. And what you want to do immediately when you start a game of any RTS game is start harvesting resources as soon as possible. So here we go. So I have my 4 workers. I immediately send them to go work, and I start training another worker. So down here in the right-hand side, you have all of the different abilities that each unit has. So you can move, stop, attack, etc. When you click on a building for the Protoss or the Terran, you can see that you have the option to train units. That training of units costs, for example, this probe costs 50 minerals, you can see over my mouse cursor, and 1 supply, or 1 food. The supply is listed up here in the top right. So I've currently used 6 of my 9 supply, and that includes units that are in production. So I've now used 7 of my 9 supply, and you can see on the screen that it says when I get to 8 supply, I should build a pylon. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. This one is almost done. I can queue up another probe to be built, and I can send this one to mine minerals. So once I get to 8, I need 100 minerals to build my first pylon. So I'm going to come out here. I have 100. Now I'm going to build my first pylon. And someone says you can't see the build order screen. I don't think that's true. I think you can. It's there in the bottom right. So now what I've done is I've sent this unit to scout my opponent's base. All right. So, oops, I forgot to build another worker right away, so I'm a terrible StarCraft player. So it's telling me at 10, I should build my first gateway. So now you see as my pylon finishes, I have more food to work with. So now I'm taking this one, and I'm almost up to the 150 minerals that I need to build a gateway. So I'm going to keep my worker over here, and now I'm going to build that gateway. You can see here that the Protoss, it's red right now. It's saying I can't build it because I have to build it in this blue power or psi that this pylon introduces. So, okay, still bad at StarCraft. Keep making units, Dave. Now at 10, I build another probe. At 11, I build another probe. And then at 12, I'm going to build another gateway. Oh, look, my unit has made it to the opponent's base, and I can see what they're doing. It turns out that the built-in AI is so bad that if I attack their worker, all of their workers will follow my worker in defense, and I can basically win the game just by doing that. It's pretty cheesy, so I'm just gonna run my worker away, and they may actually follow me. So I'm going to keep building. I should build another gateway now because I'm at 12. Okay, I'm gonna just let my worker die so I don't completely crush the opponent. And I'm gonna keep going. At 13, I want to build a zealot. So once this finishes, I'll build that zealot, but I'll actually just build it now. Okay, so as you can see, whenever my units are finished, they sort of pop out of this building. I can set a rally point, which is the place that the unit will go when the unit finishes. So I'm building my second gateway, I'm building a zealot. Oh, my micro is terrible. Here we go. What am I at now? I want another pylon at 16. So we're at 16 now. I'm going to build my second pylon here. And go back. My zealot is almost done. I'm going to set a rally point out there so my units will walk out there when they're done. Now it says 2 more zealots. Okay, let's build 2 more zealots. Oh, I got to wait for my... This is actually a good lesson. So I'm currently at 16 of 17 supply. A zealot takes 2 supply to make. And so it's not letting me build another one because I have to wait for this pylon to finish. When that finishes, my supply goes up, and now I can build those zealots. All right, so that's how that works. I'm going to send my zealot out here to just scout a little bit. And now it says Nexus at natural. So I'll show you what a natural expansion means later, but it's just saying that what it wants me to do now is build another expansion out here at this base. And I want to build it as close as possible to these minerals and gas. So this is what I'm going to do. And what this allows me to do in the future is when I make more and more worker units, I'm eventually going to saturate these minerals, right? So while one worker is mining from a mineral patch, another one can't be mining from it. So you want to have control of as many minerals as possible. So what you want to do is build more expansions as the game goes on. So this is building an expansion here, and it's called the natural expansion because it's the natural place for an expansion. It's the closest place to my base where I could build an expansion. Then it's saying I want to build an assimilator. So an assimilator, every unit can harvest minerals and gas, but you can't harvest gas until you've actually built a refinery on top of the gas place. And the refinery of the Protos race is called an assimilator. Then it's saying build a cybernetics core. So that's a gateway. I don't want that. Cybernetics core. Here we go. I'm going to warp into cybernetics core. And as soon as this finishes building, then what I have to do is send 3 workers to go mine gas from there. Someone just had a good suggestion. Why don't I go scout again? Yeah, so once my scout leaves, so this is called the fog of war, okay? I cannot see into the fog of war. Once I've uncovered a region, I can only see the buildings that were there when I was there. But I can't see any new things that are happening. So let me go scout them again. Oops, my assimilator is done. I'm going to select 3 of my workers and send them to the assimilator. It just so happens that 3 is the maximum saturation for an assimilator because as soon as one is done, the other one pops out. I'm going to start making a bunch of worker units, send them over here. Maybe I'll build a pylon. And I'll show you one more thing. I'm going to build a forge. A forge will allow me to make cannons. Let me speed up the game a little bit. The game speed is not at its highest. There we go. Now things are going a little bit sooner. Let's check on how my scout is doing. What is my opponent building? Okay, so my opponent is building a forge. They've got a couple of zealots. So they're not doing a whole lot right now. Oh, they've got a Citadel of Adun. So, oh, they're going for Dark Templar, it looks like. So that's not good. Dark Templar are invisible units that can, like, one-shot all my workers. So what I need to do in order to protect from that is build cannons. My forge is finished, so now I'm going to build some cannons here. And cannons are static defenses that allow... Oh, my expansion is done. And so these cannons can detect invisibility, and this is the only way into my base. This is a choke point. And so this will protect me from the early attack of my opponent while I get more and more supply. Now, anyone who's actually a StarCraft player knows how poorly I'm doing by this point in the game. I can do things like get upgrades, so I can train an upgrade and that will make my melee units do more damage. My workers here, I have to send them to mine things. So this is essentially how it goes. Eventually, maybe I'll make, you know, a bunch more zealots and attack my opponent, right? I just kind of want to wait until my opponent attacks me so that you can see the attack, but that may take a while. Oh, there we go. So there's the invisible unit that the computer just sent into my defenses that can detect invisible units. But that's why it's very important to scout your opponent, right? Because if I didn't see that they were making that building that can make invisible units, I wouldn't have built these detectors, and I would have just died to that one unit. That's how powerful, like, Dark Templars are. So I would have been scrambling to try and make early defenses to defend against that unit. So that's all I really need to show you. I don't need to do much more. That's sort of the way the game goes. You can build more expansions, etc. So let's, I just want to show you the Zerg real quick, so I'll quit that mission. It gives me a little bit of information on, oh, never mind. So let's do that again, but we'll do it with the Zerg. We'll do it on a 4-player map this time, so that I can show you, I don't want 4 computers, I want 1 computer. And there we go. So the computer player is going to be random, meaning that it will be randomly assigned one of the 3 races. So let's get started with a Zerg game. So at the start, the Zerg have 4 drones, and they have larvae, and they have an overlord. So pylons gave the Protos their supply, overlords give the Zerg their supply. And the unique thing about overlord is that it's a flying unit that can be used for scouting. Now, Zerg units don't get trained at a building. These larvae, you have to select the larvae and then choose which unit you want that to morph into. So you can do that by clicking the hatchery, hitting S to select all of your larvae, and then hitting D to create more drones. So it's a really unique race. A lot of people enjoy playing Zerg because of how unique it is. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go a 9-pool build, which means at 9 drones, we're going to build a spawning pool, which will allow us to make Zerglings. So there we go. So now that I have 9, I want to build a spawning pool. So I'm going to spawning pool is 200 minerals. So I have to wait until 200 minerals to start. Now, what I'm going to do with this guy is I'm going to go and scout. Because I don't know, this is a 4-player map. So the enemy could have randomly started at any of the 4 starting locations. And if I want to attack really quickly, I need to know where that enemy is. And so I have to send out one of my units here to scout to see where they are. So now I have enough for my spawning pool, so I'm going to build the spawning pool. And the Zerg workers actually turn into the buildings. So every building that you make with the Zerg, is 1 fewer worker that you don't have anymore. Oops, I forgot to build an overlord, so I'm gonna have to build an overlord when I get to 100 minerals. And then I'll go check on my scouting. Alright, there's 100. Here is my worker, pops out. I'm gonna send the worker over here. And now I'm waiting until the spawning pool is done. Because if I try and make Zerglings now, it says I require a spawning pool to make Zerglings, right? So this is that prerequisite thing again. Oh, look. So I found the opponent's base. It's over here. I'm going to attack to sort of, you know, harass them a little bit. And then I'll send it back in so I don't completely destroy them immediately. And I'm just waiting for this spawning pool to be done so that I can make my Zerglings. So larvae for the Zerg come back over time, but you can only have a maximum of 3 at any time per hatchery. So the Zerg actually want to make hatcheries really, really quickly because all of their production depends on how many hatcheries they actually have. So I haven't done that yet, but let's go make an expansion. So where's my expansion on this level? I don't actually know. Looks like it's out here. So I'm going to build a second hatchery out here so that I can build more units. Okay, here we go. I just heard my Zerglings are done. So I've done a very poorly, slowly executed Zergling rush, but let's see how it does. Now my Zerglings are all running to the enemy base. I'm going to turn up... Ooh, I don't want to load a game. I want to speed up the game. For some reason that didn't save last time. And I'm going to keep making Zerglings. And I'm going to set the rally point for here to over here so that when my Zerglings finish, they're going to run straight to the enemy base. So that rally point is quite handy sometimes. My second hatchery is building right now. My Zerglings are finished and they're running over. Now I'm going to hotkey these. So if you hit Control and then a number... Oh, so my opponent is expanding. I can tell that they probably don't have many defenses, so this is probably going to do quite well against them. So my Zerglings are killing all their workers because they went for an economic build, and I went for an offensive build. So they didn't have any defenses, they went for that early expansion, and now they're dead, essentially. So I can see... up here that there's creep, which means there's a second hatchery up here. So let me just attack this. I'll attack these workers. And so this is a Zergling rush. Usually it doesn't win this quickly, but that's sort of the thing that the Zerg are really famous for, right? And over the years, there have been a lot of Zergling rush bots created because it's so easy to implement a Zergling rush bot. So when you make your StarCraft AI, one of the things you may want to work on, maybe you want to do a Zergling rush bot, for example, because it's so easy. All right, so I just want to go until the game is done. This shouldn't take much longer. Let me turn down the sound a little bit. That's a bit obnoxious. There we go. So I'll just make some more Zerglings. Oh, my hatchery up here is done now, so I can make even more Zerglings. And you'll see here, as soon as I destroy the final building, even though the Zerg still has units left, like these overlords, it's killing all the buildings that actually makes you victorious. So we claim victory, it goes to the score screen, and it just gives you some score that doesn't really mean much, but it shows you how many units you created, structures, resources gathered, etc., etc. Okay. So that, in a nutshell, is StarCraft, and I don't need to show you the Terran race because they're the easiest of all. Just make some Marines and attack people, essentially. Okay, so let's get back to the PowerPoint. All right, so what we did was we just showed you this build order, which was the 10-12 gateway for Protos, and then I showed you how the Zerg works. Or, sorry, yeah, how Zerg works and like an early game rush with the Zerg. And it worked out pretty well. You could have implemented that a lot faster, especially if you have a computer program controlling all the units. But when you're bad at StarCraft like me, and you also are trying to explain things, it can be difficult mentally to do that. So one of the problems that we have to solve when we're actually playing StarCraft is what build order do I do? What things do I construct, right? How to predict what my enemy army is based on my current observation, and where do I place my buildings? So you saw an example of that in my Protoss game against the Protoss, because what I did was I was just going for an early expansion, right? I made a couple of Zealots, I went for an early expansion. My goal at the beginning, like I said, was to make a bunch of Zealots. But then I scouted the enemy, I saw that they had the Templar archives, and I said, oh my god, if they have a Templar archives, then they're going for Dark Templars. And if I don't get some C and Viz stuff up, or some cannons up, they'll probably kill me really quickly. And I got my cannons up like 1 minute before the Dark Templar arrived. And so that's the sort of decision-making that you have to be doing as a player of the game. And it turns out that sort of decision-making is a lot easier for humans than it is for AI. And it's actually quite difficult to make responsive bots that react in a way that's like strategically optimal, if you will, for a game. All right. And people have tried to use like machine learning for stuff like this, and some people have had some success, some people haven't. So on with the explanation of StarCraft. Some more of the nitty-gritty details now that you'll need to know, not necessarily as a player, but as a programmer, definitely. So damage types. Excuse me. StarCraft units have different damage types. There's a link to it here if you want to go look at it. So there's 3 types of damage in StarCraft. There's normal damage, and I'm talking about attacking damage here. So when you take your unit and click attack and then click your opponent's unit, there's 3 types of damage. Most units deal what's called normal damage. And normal damage deals an equal amount of damage to all units. And what I mean is that if you deal 10 normal damage, every unit in the game will take 10 damage from that, minus armor. So the way that damage is calculated in StarCraft is, let's say I deal 10 damage and you have 2 armor, then 10 damage minus 2 armor is 8. And so that's how damage and armor works in the game, but there are also types of damage. So normal, same to everybody. Concussive damage deals full damage to small units, but less damage to larger units. Some Terran units do concussive damage, like the Vulture, for example. So the Vulture deals a lot of damage to small units, but its attacks do almost nothing to larger units like tanks. And then there's explosive damage, and explosive damage is almost like the exact opposite of concussive damage, where it deals full damage to large units, but less damage to smaller units. And tanks do explosive damage, for example. So I just wanted to mention that there are damage types in the game, and if you see the opponent have a specific type of unit, maybe you want to make a specific type of damage. Also, some units have area of effect damage, so there's AoE explosions like tanks. There's line AoE damage. For example, fire bets shoot flamethrowers and can damage things in a line, etc., etc. All right. Probably the most important thing about StarCraft are the maps. And you may say that that's, some people argue that, but like the people praise StarCraft for how balanced it is. They say all 3 races are perfectly balanced, right? Because over the course of human professional play in the last 23 years, there's no huge win rate difference between the 3 races. So people say that the races are balanced. But in actual fact, you can't just say that the races are balanced, because balance depends heavily on the map that you play on. So for example, if you started a game where, like, if you had a map where there was Protos and Zerg, for example, right? Depending on the type of base and depending on, like, if you started right next to each other, the game is not balanced. If you literally have your 4 units versus another 4 units, like, probes are the strongest starting unit in the game because they have shields that regenerate, and they have 20 and 20, they deal 5 damage, so 4 probes against 4 drones will win. But then if you separate the bases a little bit more, then the Zerg could get out Zerglings before the Protoss could get out Zealots. And so the Zerg will win that game, because if you know exactly where they are, then a Zergling rush is really powerful. So the balance of the game depends highly on the map that you play. And you'll see this, it's not saying that's an auto win in some cases, and I've made up these super contrived examples, but the construction of the map is very important. All right, so what is a StarCraft map? Well, if we look here, my face is covering this a little bit, but that's okay. We don't need to remove that for now. This map right here, maps have starting locations. So there's 4 starting locations on this particular map, okay? So there's one here, one down here, there's one right behind my webcam, just up here, and there's one right here, okay? Those starting locations, at the start of a game of StarCraft, each player in the game is randomly placed on one of those start locations based on an internal game seed, okay? That we actually have control of it in BWAPI if we want to, but as a player, you don't have control of that random seed, and so you just get placed in a random location. So that means if a map has exactly 2 locations, you know where you start, and so therefore you know where the other player is, right? So that first game that I played was on that map that only had 2 starting locations. So like if these were the only 2 starting locations and I start here, then I know my opponent is right here. But as you saw with that Zerg game, I didn't know exactly where my opponent was, so I had to guess. I saw, okay, I guess they're here, I'll send my unit there, and I got lucky that game. It was the first place that I checked. But had it been on the opposite corner of the map, maybe my rush doesn't work now because they're further away. So that's the starting locations on a map. And those are hard-coded into the map file. Next, you have these things called choke points, okay? And a choke point, your base in StarCraft is typically going to be surrounded by some sort of geometry, right? So in this example here, we have this area. I'm trying my best to draw this perfectly. So where I've drawn that, that's actually a cliff on the map. And you can't walk over that cliff with ground units, right? So the only way that you can enter this base at the start of a game is via this choke point. So let's say that my unit started up here. I would have to walk through my own choke point, then come down through here, and then walk through the opponent's choke point to get into their base, right? So what these choke points do are very strategic, because as Protoss or as Terran, I can actually create buildings in my choke point so that you can't have units enter the base to see what I'm doing. Zerg are a little bit disadvantaged that they can't do that because of the creep on the ground. So let me just discard these annotations real quick. All right, so what it means is that, for example, if the maps were not created with these choke points, then you could just enter the base from any direction. You could surround your opponent and the game would not be balanced at all. Like, not in the way that it currently is. There are very few maps in which you just have wide open bases without choke points. It's very difficult to balance around that. Next, you have expansions. And expansions are places that you can expand or build another resource depot. Okay, so for example, if you were at this base and you wanted to build an expansion, well, you could technically build it anywhere that you want, but typically what you want to do is build your expansion at a location that's closest to your own base, okay? So again, typically there's this sort of, what do you call it? Like a pattern in good maps where you have your base, it's surrounded by some sort of wall, your main base has a choke point, and then outside the choke point is the natural expansion. It's the natural place that you would want to go. Then that expansion has a slightly wider choke point. Okay, so you can see here that this choke point is much wider. And so the expansion is not as well defendable as the natural base is. And that's all by design because of the way that the StarCraft units work, the way that the tech transitions. This is how it helps balance the game. Okay. And then the last type of feature, and now, technically this here is an expansion as well. This here is an expansion, but these are way out in the open. And so like you may not want to expand here first because it would be much harder to defend that expansion. And the last type of feature is called an island. And an island is called an island because you cannot reach it via ground. Okay, so an island is the safest type of location because an army would have to fly to get there. However, it's also the most difficult location to get to because you have to have a flying transport unit in order to build a base on an island. So for example, the Protoss would build a shuttle, pick up a few workers, fly them to the island, just like, we're all familiar with what an island is living in Newfoundland. So it's expensive to get there. And it's small and it's cramped, just like Newfoundland, right? Okay. So that is a StarCraft map, and those are the different elements of the map. So if you see on Wikipedia, 14 build expo at natural, then when you have 14 workers or 14 supply, you're going to build up here, for example. Next, we have the Fog of War, and I just explained what the Fog of War was in the game. However, Basically, the fog of war means that you cannot see where your units are not, right? And so you always have to scout to see what your opponent is doing. So my opponent's base might look like this initially. During the scouting, it looks like this. I can see what's happening. And then after the scouting, either my unit has died or I've pulled my unit away. I can see what was happening when I was there, like the buildings, but I can no longer see units that are moving around. There's also more imperfect information in the game because there are invisible units. So this unit up here, this thing you see in the ground, that is a Zerg lurker unit, and it burrows underground and shoots these spines out in a line. And the spines deal AoE damage in a line, or line damage, however you want to call it. But you cannot see these as the Terran player. So you also can't see uphill as anyone, as a ground unit in the game. So what the Zerg player here has done something very smart. They've built the lurkers on top of a hill, and then as the Terran, who can't see up the hill, actually do get up to the top of the hill, they can't see the lurkers because they're burrowed. If they have a detector unit with them, they can see them. But by the time they get up the hill, they're already dead to these spines, right? So there's lots of things to do. This is imperfect information, meaning that the Zerg player knows things that the other player doesn't. And they know that these Terran units are going to have a bad time when they walk up this hill. Okay, so there are invisible units in the game, and you need detector units. So for example, the Terran here would need a science vessel with them, or they build this thing called a ComSat station, which can scan and reveal these units buried underground. Okay, so we just played a game, and actually this is the same map that we just played on as Protos, so that was a bit of a coincidence. But let's look at an example of how a base looks like. And I kind of just explained this actually, but I'll go over it again. And it's good that I have these slides. I forgot that I have them. So this is where the player starts, okay? This here is the main base perimeter to that base. All of these cliffs here, you cannot walk up these cliffs. You can't walk on the side of the map. So the only way into the base is here via the choke point. Here we have that choke point. It's a ramp. And that ramp is the only way that we can lead into the base. Right here is the natural expansion. That is the place where we would want to expand if we want to go expand first. And down here, the natural expansion has two separate ground choke points. So this is sort of the breakdown of this map, and other maps would look different. So at the start of a game, here is how the Protoss base would look. It just has this one nexus up here and the workers. It's going to build buildings as we showed during the demo. And then during the sort of first expansion, like this is now approaching the mid-game, the Protoss base might look like this, where they have an expansion at their natural. They have some cannons defending the natural expansion. They don't have anything defending the main base right now. And so that's how it looks. They have a bunch of workers in the main base. They have a bunch of workers at the expansion. Here's how that would look for the Zerg, for example. So the Zerg are only allowed to build non-hatchery buildings on the creep. So they would... here's the Zerg at the beginning of the game. They send their overlord to go scout. Over here is their natural expansion. Here is when the Zerg start to build their expansion. They're building another hatchery out there, so you can build hatcheries on non-creep ground. And now, once their expansion is finished, you can see that this hatchery has created creep around that hatchery, and they've started another base because Zerg need lots of bases. They're this sort of expanding type race. And up here, now this is their second expansion, so their third base, and then eventually they get destroyed and all their buildings are gone. Okay, so that's sort of the progression of what the map might look like as the game is being played. Excuse me. This lecture is going to go a little bit long because I played the game for longer than I thought I would, but that's fine. That's the joy of teaching online, right? Is some can go long and some can be short. Next, I want to talk about the StarCraft grid system. And I've talked about this already previously in the grid lecture, but I'll go over this again briefly in this lecture. The StarCraft maps work on a grid system. We have different types of grids, each with their own level of precision and each with their own task that they have information stored about. Maps are drawn in-game with textures that are applied to this underlying grid. So like maps are obviously textured, right? They have all these graphics like water and ground and minerals and all that kind of thing. But like the data that the computer cares about or that your bot cares about, they don't care about any of those textures. They just care about the data that those textures represent. So the grids are not visible in-game, but all of the logic operates on those grid levels, okay? So what are those StarCraft grids? Well, here you can see an example of the 3 different types of grids that we have in the game. The red level over here is the pixel level. So this is literally 1 pixel in resolution. And so units, their size and bounding box is measured in pixels. And units move in pixel increments in the game. And if you want to represent a pixel precision location in BWAPI, and we'll get to this, that'll be a BWAPI position. So BWAPI position has a 1:1 pixel resolution. So that's the highest level of resolution, the most precision that you can have. Next is this gray grid. So you see that these green grids are created of these 4x4 gray grids. So these are called walk tiles. And that is how the map specifies which areas of the game are walkable or not walkable. And so units cannot overlap gray tiles that are false, that say you can't walk here. And in BWAPI, if you want to represent a walk tile position, it's called a BWAPI walk position. Now that is almost never used. I have a 30,000 line of code bot that never uses the walk position. So just kind of ignore that exists. I'm just including it for completeness. And then another important one is the build tile precision. So the build tile precision is this green one. It's 32 by 32 pixels, and buildings can only be placed on this level of resolution. So you saw when I was trying to build a building in the game, it was sort of this clunky square-based movement. That was the build tile resolution. You cannot place a building on any build tile that contains an unwalkable walk tile. So that's just another little tidbit of information, and this is called a BWAPI tile position. So for example here, up here in the top left, this might be tile position 0, 0, tile position 1, 0, tile position. So let's say we go here, what is this tile position? Well, it might be 0, 1, 2 in the X direction, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that would be tile position 2, 9 in the tile position grid. But then we have to convert that position to pixels in some instances. So you'd multiply each of those values by 32 to get the pixel level precision. All right. So in StarCraft, you build things on the build grid. So my buildings can only be placed on this level, and you can only walk at the walk grid resolution. However, there's something a little bit... StarCraft has some really annoying things. One of the annoying things is that even though you place a building, for example, a hatchery up here at a tile resolution, the bounding box of that hatchery is still at a pixel resolution. So if you have 2 hatcheries placed right next to each other so that their tile positions are touching, you can actually still fit units between them because unit collision is done at a pixel level. So there's some technical details going on there that I won't get into, but just know that like if you have 2 buildings that are placed right next to each other, a Zergling might be able to run by them. And you're saying, why is that? Well, that's why that's the case. And so again, we have the green build tile, we have the gray walk tile, and we have the red pixel resolution. And in StarCraft, we have this buildable grid that's at the tile 32 by 32 resolution. So here, what this is saying is I'm trying to build another command center, it's saying these green areas are okay, but I can't place it here because of these red areas. So one of the rules in the game is that you cannot place a command center within 3 tiles, X or Y, of any resource. So this is saying I can't build it here because it's too close to this refinery, so I've got to move it over a little bit. StarCraft 2's build tile grid is a little bit nicer looking, but it accomplishes the same task. And you can see here an example of using that grid. I showed that before, so I won't show it again. All right. So I talked about these underlying grids and the data they contain. However, now I'm going to try and show you that. So I wrote a program, and I'm not going to talk about that program now. I'll talk about it next time. But essentially, it takes the StarCraft map data and creates a drawing of a grid with the data in it. So if this is the actual map, this is a visualization of the underlying data that those grids store. Okay, so just look, I'll go back and forth so you can see like the outlines of the bases actually do match up with this grid. Okay, you can see that? Okay, so what this grid represents is the data that StarCraft uses to make all of its internal physics calculations and stuff. And here's what that data means. So if it's black, it means like this area here, this area here, this area here. It means that we can't walk or build on that tile. Okay? Gray, this gray here, means that we can walk and we can build on that tile. So you can basically do anything on these gray tiles. Okay? The yellow tiles are tiles that we can walk on, but we can't build on. And the reason for that is that this one here, for example, this is a ramp and you can't build on ramps. And this area of the bridge is, they've made that type of ground such that you can't build on it. So specifically, you don't want people to be able to build buildings inside choke points. And so the map data says you can't build there. The purple, or I guess this not exactly purple, but the bluish purple here, these locations, they are locations that are too close to resources to build. So to build a command center. So I cannot build a command center or a nexus or a hatchery on any of these purple tiles. The red is where the start location is. So that's where you actually start the game. The teal is where minerals are, and the green is where gas is. So you take this is what this looks like in the actual game. And then this is the data at this sort of scale that you'll probably be working with for your bot. And so you'll query the game engine and you'll say, okay, can I walk on this tile? Can I build on this tile? Is there a mineral here? Is there a gas here? Stuff like that. So I just wanted to show you that this is what the actual game is doing. And the software I wrote for that, it's called StarDraft. And so it's a, draft in terms of mapping. And so clever name, right? And so you can do base location parsing with this. Like figuring out where the natural expansion is actually not a trivial task for your bot. So you may have to use some program like this to find bases, but you probably won't be going that far in this assignment or in this project. So don't worry about that too much. So there's lots of different types of maps in the game. The maps can contain up to 8 players, from 2 to 8 players. They can have different tile sets, etc. But none of this tile set stuff matters because all the bot cares about is the grid data. All right. Lastly, we get to combat. Combat is a very difficult problem for AI to solve. Your goal is to kill the enemy units. However, you can do advanced tactics, like you can do surrounding your opponent. You can flank your opponent from different directions. You can kite your opponent where you're attacking and moving back, attacking and moving back. All these sorts of things, they're quite difficult to compute in a bot. So if you don't manage to get that far, don't worry. They're not super required for this project. But in your specialization that you want to focus on for your project, maybe you want to say something like, we're going to do like a Dragoon Rush build with our bot, and we want to focus on trying to get that Dragoons to kite units effectively or something like that. So you could focus on one of these areas if you want to. But if you're not focusing on that, just attack the closest enemy of the unit. It's a pretty good heuristic. Doesn't always work in human games, but it's pretty good for bot versus bot games. And we already kind of talked about this, but scouting. In order to attack your enemy, you need to know where their base is located. So some maps have more than 2 starting locations, so you're going to need to scout. And scouting is usually done with your worker unit after you've made a supply depot, or a pylon, or a spawning pool for the Zerg. And again, just to show you what bases look like, in order to scout, like if my opponent, again, is over here, or I don't know where my opponent is, but if I start over here, I would have to take a path like this to go scout up here, or maybe I'd take this path to go scout down here. And this is something that you need to do with your units in order to find the enemy. Okay, so that was the introduction to StarCraft. Now I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the Brood War API and how you would use it. But in the next lecture, 2 lectures from now, I'm going to go more in depth with this. So the Brood War API is an API that's used to talk to StarCraft with C++. Now, the base Brood War API is C++, but there are sort of wrappers around BWAPI, so you can get like, there's Java versions, there might be a Python version, but in this course, we're sticking with the C++ version. It injects a DLL into the StarCraft process and allows it to communicate with your C++ program. And when the game starts, BWAPI connects to the game, and it's going to record events and these events trigger things in your code. So for example, when the game starts, the onStart function is called in your code. At each frame of the game, the onFrame function is called in your code. When a unit dies, you could have onUnitDestroy be called in your code. And then when the game is over, BWAPI disconnects, okay? So just really quickly, here's sort of, and we'll get more into this in a couple of lectures, but there are a bunch of different events that can be called within BWAPI, and then you can assign functions to your bot that happen when those events occur. And so, for example, in the on frame is where you're going to be handling your units. On start, maybe is where you choose your strategy. On unit destroy, maybe you have to calculate how many things you've lost, etc., etc. In order to create a bot, it's a pretty daunting task to just go do it from complete scratch. So what I've done is I've created something called StarCraft. I've got a tutorial video out there already for StarCraft. It's very easy to set up. You can find it on GitHub. And if you are doing the StarCraft project for this course, you have to use StarCraft as your starting point, because I want everyone sort of on the same level playing field for their bot. So how would you control units in StarCraft using BWAPI? Well, you're going to use the unit interface. So there's a class inside BWAPI called unit. And I've created a fake function here just so you can see some of the different commands that you can send to a unit. So let's say, for example, that I want my unit to move to a specific position on the map. And I've calculated that position somehow. Maybe it's where I see an enemy unit, or maybe it's a mineral that I want to go mine or something like that. But I have some desired position. So I'm going to set up a BWAPI position. And I say BWAPI position. This is a namespace, and this is a class inside that namespace. I'm going to call that desired position. It's at 400 in the X direction and 300 in the Y direction. And since this is a position, those are pixel coordinates. If I want my unit to move to that position, it's really easy. I'm going to say unit move desired position. It turns out that the unit class, this BWAPI unit is actually underneath, it's a pointer. So we're going to use the pointer syntax and say unit move desired position. Or I could say unit right click desired position. And that would emulate exactly what the unit does when I right click in the game. Or I could say unit attack move desired position. So in the game, there are 2 types of movement. There's 3 different types of commands you can give to a unit in order to move somewhere, right? I could say move to a location. If I say move to a location, it will ignore absolutely everything else in the game and just walk without attacking until it gets to that exact position. If I say attack another unit, it will walk and ignore everything else until it gets into attack range of that unit, and then it will attack that unit. But if I say attack move, then what it will happen is it will walk toward that place on the map, but it will attack everything that it sees on the way to that unit. So move, attack, and attack move are 3 separate behaviors. I could also tell it to patrol to the desired position. And in StarCraft, patrolling means that if I tell a unit to patrol to a particular location, it will walk to that location, and then it will come back to the original location, and it will oscillate back and forth until it's killed. All right. If I want to do something to an enemy unit or another unit in the game, let's say I have some function which says get enemy unit target. So this is going to go out and do some logic, and maybe it, for example, gets the closest enemy unit and returns the unit pointer to that unit. So now I have a unit pointer called enemy unit. If I want my unit to attack that unit, I just say unit attack enemy unit. So the attack function can either take in a position or it can take in a unit. I can also say right click the unit. I could also have my unit burrow. So if units have special abilities, you can call those on units as well. Or if I wanted to stop doing something, I can just say stop. So it's a very simple interface to tell units to execute a given command. Really, really easy. As I said before, each unit in the game has a number of properties. And in order to get unit instance properties, you use BWAPI unit. So for example here, if I wanted to ask how many hit points this particular unit instance has left, I can say unit get health, right? However, there are unit type properties as well. So that unit might be a marine. So if I say unit get type, then it will return the marine type. And then I could ask the marine type, how much damage does that unit do? Okay. So here are some more examples of important functions in BWAPI. So the unit class is an important structure. It accesses all unit information. The unit type is also very important. So this would be a marine, a zergling, a nexus, whatever. So if you want to get, for example, how many minerals it costs to train a particular unit type, then you say BWAPI unit type, and we can get the type of a unit by calling get type on that unit. Maybe the most important class in the game is actually the game instance object. And you get all the information about the game from this particular object. So this object is called, it's a BWAPI game object, but its name is Brood War. So you say BWAPI Brood War, which gives you access to the instance of that object that lives for the whole game. It's globally accessible. And you can call a bunch of different things from that. So for example, if you want to know the current frame of the game, you can say BWAPI Brood War get frame count, and it will tell you how far you are into this particular game. You could also say, give me all the units in the game, and it will give you a vector of all the units in the game. You can say, is the game over yet? Or specific details of the map, etc. There's a BWAPI player object, okay? So this player object contains stuff that's specific to you, the player. So for example, how many minerals does this player have? How many minerals do I have? Well, I would say BWAPI Brood War self, that is me. And then that self object, I could say get mineral count or something like that. I can't remember the exact name, but that will give you how many units that you have. The position object. So where is a unit? So for example, this unit, I could say get position, and it would give me that position. All right, so those are just some of the important classes that you'll be using. We'll go over more of those in a future lecture. So here's an example of how you might do something with a unit in the game. We'll see what this does by investigating the code. So if you see this function in someone's bot. Let's see if we can figure out what it does. Okay, so let's iterate over all of the units in the game. So how would we do that? Well, we would ask BWAPI Brood War to give me all the units. So BWAPI Brood War get all units. This returns a reference to a vector containing all the units in the game. And we can iterate over that in a number of ways, but we're going to use just a range-based for loop. So we're saying for auto unit in get all units. So this is going to give us, for each unit in the game, a pointer to that unit called unit. So let's say, okay, here's a position, which is the unit's position. Okay, so I've figured out the unit's position. Here is the player that controls that unit. Okay, so the player is unit get player. Let's say I want to figure out whether or not that unit belongs to me or the enemy, right? So I can set up a bool, which is my unit, and I'm going to compare whether or not the player that controls my unit is that equal to me, right? So if that player pointer is equal to the player pointer that is me, then that is my unit. Let's say I want to get access to the current hit points of the unit, right? Well, I can say unit get hit points. And so that will give me an integer corresponding to the unit hit points. Next, I want to get the unit type. Well, I can get the unit type just like this. If I want to know how much damage this unit does to ground units, then I can say type.groundweapon.damage amount. And then I can store that and I can compute it. So maybe, for example, I want to look at all the enemy's units and see who's the biggest threat by comparing their ground weapon damage. Then I can do something like this. I can see whether or not that unit is a worker by asking, is it a worker? That's built into the unit type. Whether or not I want to say, okay, is that unit specifically a Protos probe? How would I be able to figure that out? Or maybe I'd want to say, is it an overlord, for example? Well, I can set up a variable here, is probe, and I can say, is this unit equal to a Protos probe? So luckily for us, BWAPI contains a namespace called unit types, which contains all of the different unit types in the game. So I can actually say, is the type equal to BWAPI unit types Protos probe? Or that could be Zerg overlord or Zerg drone or whatever you want it to be. So those are just some more examples. And so BWAPI unit acts like a pointer, BWAPI player acts like a pointer, etc. All right, just give me a second. I saw out in the chat there, someone asked if this is live. Yep, this is live. How can he talk nonstop for an hour and a half? Well, it's not easy. I haven't lectured in a couple of weeks because of midterm break, and my voice is starting to go. But you get used to it after a while if that's your job to do that. Actually, in the fall, I lecture for 3 hours because I have 2 classes, and that's brutal. All right. Resource gathering. How would we do that with BWAPI, right? So in order to build units, you first need to gather resources with your workers. It's really easy for a human because we have like great image processing. I just click one of my workers and then click the mineral. But how do I do that with a bot? Well, here's an example. Maybe we find the closest mineral, then see which worker is free, and then send that mineral to mine send that worker to mine the mineral. So let's see how we do a simple thing like that in BWAPI. So in this here, what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of our workers. We're going to see which of them are idle. And an idle unit in the game is one that is currently not doing anything. It's just standing there. Okay. So this is going to be our function called gather minerals. And we're going to see when we get more in depth, this is actually what the starter bot uses to gather minerals. So first, I have to iterate over all of my units. So what I could do is what I showed before. I could have a range-based for loop over all the units in the game, and then I could determine whether or not that unit was my unit. However, for convenience, BWAPI has another function, which if I say BWAPI Brood War self, that's the pointer to me, I can get all of my own units immediately, okay? So it uses a little bit more memory, but I don't have to iterate over all units and then check the owner. I can just iterate over the units that my player, uses. All right, so I want to look at all idle workers. So the first thing I have to do is check to see if it's a worker. So if I can check to see if it's a worker by saying unit get type dot is worker. Okay. So if it's not a worker, then continue, meaning I don't want to use this worker. So there's two ways that you can do this sort of programming. And this is kind of a lesson for all of programming, not just this. Oh, hang on. We're getting a bot troll raid. I got to ban some people. Ban. Normally I don't mention this, but I want the break in talking anyway. Okay. So there's two sort of ways that you can do this sort of thing. What I'm looking for all of my units that are both workers and idle. So what I could do is have an if statement that says if it's a worker, and then inside that if statement, I could have another if statement that says if it's idle. But now what's happening is that I'm like 5 levels of indentation deep, right? So what I prefer to do is instead of having an and if statement inside another if statement, I prefer to eliminate things, right? So instead of saying if this and inside that saying if again, and then inside that saying if again, what I'm going to say is if it's not a worker, continue. That means skip the whole thing and go to the next unit. And then anything after this line, I know that I'm working with a worker, right? No pun intended. Next, I'm going to say if this unit isn't idle, continue. So now I know that I have a worker, but I want to work with only idle ones. So if it's not idle, go to the next one. And you can see how much cleaner this is than having like 2 nested if statements inside the for statement, right? I think it's much cleaner and I prefer to work like this. Because now I know that any unit that makes it past these 2 checks is an idle worker. Okay? So what I'm going to do is let's say I have a function and that function is get closest mineral. So I want to get the closest mineral to that unit, store it in a unit pointer, and then I'm going to say unit right-click mineral. So what I've done here is I've found all of the idle workers, then I find the closest mineral to that idle worker, and I right-click the idle worker on the mineral to start harvesting it. Yep. Okay, someone asked about time complexity. This is the exact same time complexity, it's just less indentation. Alrighty. And then the worker will continue to mine unless you stop it or it gets attacked or something like that. Now, I use that function, get closest mineral. So let's go through that function just as an example. So what this function is going to do is I'm going to pass in a unit. I'm going to call that my unit. And it's going to return a unit as well because minerals are units. Refineries are units. Gas are units, right? So a mineral is still a unit. It's just a neutral unit that we can't control. So let's find the closest mineral to the unit that I pass in. So this closest mineral, that's going to be the variable that I return. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up to be null pointer. And so since it's underneath, it's actually the actual implementation is a pointer. So what this means is that if I don't find a closest mineral, because there might not be any minerals left on the map, right? If I don't find a closest mineral, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return null. And so then I could check, well, if I have a null pointer, then I haven't found a closest mineral. So I'm going to essentially set a number to -infinity. Then I'm going to look at the distances from all the minerals to my unit and set if I've found a new closest one. So what I can do, if I want to get all the neutral units, in the game, because a mineral is a neutral unit, I can do this. So I can iterate over Brood War get neutral units. Now I can get the distance, okay? So I take my unit, the unit that I'm iterating over. So this might be a mineral. Unit get distance, my unit. So that's the distance. If the distance is less than the current minimum distance, then I set the minimum distance and I set the closest mineral, okay? Now, technically, what I've written here is incorrect because I have not checked to see if this neutral unit is actually a mineral. So in a couple of days, when I give the actual example, we're going to fix this. But just know that I'm missing one check here, and I'm not checking to see if that unit's a mineral. And then I return the closest mineral. So that's it. So a functionality like getting the closest mineral to a unit is actually pretty simple to implement. And you can see now, like, yeah, a bot is going to have like 100 functions like this. Attack the closest unit, get the closest mineral, etc., all that kind of stuff. All right. Maps. It might be difficult to parse the maps in an interesting way. So there are map libraries out there available. If you do want to use one, I don't really think that the scope of your project requires this level of analysis, but I would recommend BWAPI Community. It's a still maintained Brood War Easy Map library. There's an older one called BWTA, but it hasn't been maintained in a while, and the libraries are ancient, so it's difficult to link them. But what that does, these libraries actually like create like Voronoi meshes and stuff, and allow you to get different borders and an analysis of different map locations. It figures out where choke points are, etc. So if you really want that for your map, I would recommend BWAPI Community as the one that you use. The last algorithm that I'm going to show today, because it's getting a bit late, is scouting. So let's develop a simple algorithm to find the enemy base. Assume that we've already decided which of our units will be scouting. So we have a worker that we want to scout, and our goal is to scout until the enemy base has been found. All right, so let's do that. Let's create a function called scout with unit. And I'm going to pass into this function the unit that I want to be my scout. So for example, what I typically do in my bot is I say whichever unit built the first pylon or the first supply depot or whatever, that's the one that I'm going to use as my scout. So I've chosen a scout unit somehow. Now, what am I going to do? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is check to see if the scout actually exists, right? Because if it's null, if I don't have a scout yet, then I'm not going to scout with it. So null checking is good. The way that I can look at where the enemy could possibly be, Brood War provides us with all of the starting locations in the map, okay? The starting locations are stored in tile position resolution. So this is not BWAPI position, this is tile position, which is the 32 by 32 resolution. So here are all of the different places that I could possibly have a starting base in the map. Now, these start locations, this vector that it returns a reference to is going to be, the size of this is going to be equal to the number of starting locations on the map. So if I'm on a 2-player map, this will just have 2 positions. If I'm on a 4-player map, this will have 4, right? All right. So what I'm going to say is that if this tile has been explored, I want to know if I've been there yet, right? Because this is the tile. Well, what this tile actually represents is the upper left corner of where the enemy nexus starts. So the scouting location that I have in my head as a player is, well, I know where the starting locations are. So I'm going to say explore all of the different scouting locations until I've seen them all, right? So there are 2 functions that you can use built into BWAPI related to vision. One is visible. Is visible, if you call it on a tile, will tell you whether or not a tile is currently visible by one of your units. However, that's not what we want. We don't want to know if it's visible. We want to know if we have ever seen it. So if we have been there and then moved away, it won't be visible anymore, but it will still be explored. So isExplored is the function that we want to use inside BWAPI to see if we have visited a place on the map. So if this start location has not been visited yet, we want to send our scout there, essentially. So we want to send our unit there, and in order to send our unit to a position, it has to be a position. So we're going to construct a BWAPI position from the tile position, which is at a different resolution, okay? So we convert the tile to a position by creating a new position, and then we're going to create a command to send our scout to that location. All right, so technically what I could have done there is just say scout right-click position, correct? So because if I want to send my scout to that position, I can just say scout move pause. That's the simplest possible thing to do. However, as you will see, as you start to create a bot, a really annoying thing is that the game engine of StarCraft was not meant to be played by computers. And if I take a unit and every frame of the game, I send the exact same command every frame, like 24 times per second, it's going to bug out the game engine. And sometimes the unit won't even move. Okay? So what I want to do here is not every frame of the game tell the unit to move there. What I want to do is say, if the unit is not already moving there, tell it to move there. So how would I do that? Well, the first thing I need to do is get access to the thing that the scout, that unit, is currently doing, right? So if I have already given it the command to move to that location, then I don't need to give the command again. It's still walking that way, right? So I can get access to the command that the scout was last given. So that's the command object. It's a BWAPI command, and I can get access to that. So if I repeat the same command every frame, I can cause issues. So what I can say is, if the last command I gave, if the target position of that command is the same as the position of the tile, then return. Don't go there. Don't do anything else, because I'm already moving to that position. See how that works? So I'm saying, if I already told it to do this thing, quit. I don't need to do anything with the scout. It's already moving where I want it to go. But if that's not true, then it will continue on. And now I say scout move to position. And then return. Okay? So if the scout has explored all the start locations, then none of this will, I won't have any returns, right? So if the scout has explored every start location, I want the scout to move back home, right? So I can say scout move. Well, how do I tell where my home is? Well, it turns out that BWAPI Brood War self, that's the player pointer to me, has a start location. I cast that to a position, and then I move the scout there. So after I've already scouted every location on the map, I want my scout to come home, so I tell it to move to the position where my start location is. So that's it. The bot is essentially going to be you programming a bunch of these separate behaviors, right? Now, you might say, well, is that artificial intelligence? Well, this course is video game AI, and sometimes video game AI is a bunch of logic like this, because it just has to work, right? And once we've gotten a bot that's smart enough using this sort of logic, then we can work on putting more and more stuff into it. So now you've gotten a little bit of a taste of what could possibly, what bot programming looks like. What does an entire bot look like? Well, I've got an example here. This link takes us right here. This is a bot that I created called UAlbertaBot. We're not going to be using it in this course, a little bit too complicated. But here is the entire logic flow of a full-featured bot, okay? So just to go through it, here's what this bot does at a very high level. So it has this thing called a game commander, and then the game commander has different sub-commanders that handle all the different types of units. So it's going to have a worker manager. What does the worker manager do? Well, it reallocates new workers to mineral patches. It sends idle workers to gather minerals. It allocates gas workers to refineries, and then it moves workers to buildings if necessary. Then I have a production manager, which is managing the build order. It builds the buildings. The building manager checks to see if assigned workers have finished their task. It calculates the position that we want to build buildings. If a worker dies while it's building a building, what happens? It has a combat commander, which scouts the enemy. If it finds the enemy, it's going to attack the enemy. If the enemy is attacking me, it's going to defend. The scout manager is going to keep track of where the enemy base is and like where I've scouted and stuff. There's information like how many units have I killed, how many minerals have I mined, and so, you know, this can get pretty complex pretty quickly. And you can go in here, you can see all the code for UAlbertaBot if you want to, and how it works. All right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. And BWAPI can actually have some annoyances. I'll talk about this in the future when we start talking about it more, but just figuring out exactly the frame of the game where a unit has issued its attack is a pretty complex topic. I actually have a paper on this. I'll talk about this later, though. I was going to talk about StarCraft AI agents in this lecture, but I took more time to explain the other things. So I'll talk about this in a future lecture, and I'll just end it right there. So let's see here. Let's go back to the schedule. So we just talked about Intro to StarCraft. Thursday's lecture, remember assignment 3 is due on Thursday. I'm going to be talking again about assignment 4, which is the project setup. I'll go over that again, and I'll show how to set up StarCraft for the StarCraft people, and I'll show how to set up Minecraft for the Minecraft people. And so that will be Thursday's lecture. And then I'm still not 100% sure what order I want to present things in after that, but we'll see after Thursday's lecture. So thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.